To start your centerpiece, you begin with the oval stone. The oval stone will be placed down on the oval shape on the center of your template. It's important not to glue these stones in place because they don't react well with glue on the back side of them. So simply hold your stone in place while you work. Or if you like, you can add your initial row of beads just beyond the oval that's drawn on your template. Start a new length of knotted thread and bring your needle from the back to the front of the non-woven stitching base just beyond the outside edge of the drawn oval that has a black outline. Start back stitching 2 beads at a time around this oval shape. So pick up 2 11Os, 11As, stitch down about 2 beads width away from front to back. I'm going to just put this aside. And then from back to front through the non-woven stitching base just before that first 11O. Then stitch through those 2 beads again. Repeat this process all the way around. Pick up 2 beads, stitch down about 2 beads width away, and then stitch back from back to front through the non-woven stitching base between the 3rd and the 4th bead back. And then stitch through the last 3 beads again. It's important to only add 2 beads at a time for this process so that you end up with an even number of beads at the end. If you're going to add the beads like this without holding the oval in place while you work, make sure that the edge of the beads doesn't go beyond that black line that outlines the oval shape. You don't want to be centering your beads on that black line. You want them to be to the outside of the line. Otherwise, your bezel will end up being too small for the cabochon. As you get near the end of your backstitched row of beads, you're going to want to check your fit by placing your stone in the center of the beads. And I'm trying to determine how many beads I can fit in this space. It's either going to have to be 2 or 4. So I think I'm going to try to get 4 beads in this space. They may look a little wonky at first, but by the next row, they should straighten out a little bit. It's better to have too many than too few in this bezeling technique, because too few would just make for a bezel that has a lot of thread showing in the next few rows. So as you add the last 2 beads, I like to do it by stitching into the first bead in the row, then stitching down into the base, and then back 4 beads, and then through the last bead in the previous pair of beads, and then the next 2 beads added, and then I'll go through several beads in the row to try to straighten this little area out. Okay, so I've got this little wonky area, but that's okay. I'm just going to go with it and work my first row of peyote stitch. So I'm going to hold the stone in place as I work. Coming out of any bead, I'm going to pick up an 11A, skip the next 11A and stitch through the one after that. And pull tight when you do this. I'll repeat this all the way around. So not only am I pulling tight as I go, but as I'm working these stitches, I'm kind of trying to make the previous stitches sit up against the stone rather than out to the side. Just kind of pushing them in place. When I add the last bead in this last space here, I'm skipping a bead, going into the next bead, and then stepping up through the first bead added in the first row of peyote stitch. Pulling tight. Now I'm going to add a row of 15 O's in peyote stitch. So pick up a 15 O and stitch through the next up bead. So this was the next bead added in the previous row. And then just repeat that all the way around. Continuing to hold the stone in place because it won't be held in place until you finish this row. When you add the last bead in the row, step up just so you have a nice even thread tension, and then weave down the beads in a stepwise manner and into the beaded base, the non-woven stitching base, through to the other side. So the bezel is complete. Pull really tight after you do that to tighten up that last row, and if you don't think the last row is enough to hold the stone in place, you can stitch through that row again to tighten it up more, and you can even add a second row of 15 O's in peyote stitch. Then once you're down in the non-woven stitching base, just make a couple of stitches close to the bezel to sort of lock the bezel in place before adding the pearls. To add the pearls around the bezel, bring your thread out of the bezel about 2 to 3 millimeters away from the bottom row of the peyote stitch base. Pick up 15 pearls. This is the exact number that fits around the bezel. Bring them down to the end of the thread and then wrap them around the bezel, taking up any slack in the thread. Stitch down right before that first pearl picked up to kind of get these beads to sit around the bezel. Now we're going to do couching. So come up between two nearby pearls on one side of the thread between them, and then stitch down on the other side of the thread between them. So this new thread is going to hold the thread between the pearls down. Move a couple pearls over and do the same thing. And then repeat. So you want to couch down at least in 5 to 6 spaces around this round of beads. This is kind of just setting up an equal spacing between them. Once you've couched around the row of beads, then you can go and backstitch the beads in place to hold them in their spots better. So you can either backstitch one at a time or two at a time. By stitching through one, stitching down into the non-woven stitching base, and then back through the last bead you stitched through. So then stitch through 2 beads to advance, and repeat. Stitch down through the non-woven stitching base, back up from back to front, then through 2 beads. After backstitching all the purls down, bring your thread out, or bring your needle out of the non-woven stitching base between 2 purls, but not quite at the same place you would have had a thread from the back stitching. Not quite right in the center, sort of to the outside. Pick up 5 of your 11 A's and stitch down in the same spot between the next 2 purls. It's the spot where if you're looking straight down between the beads, it's sort of the point where the 2 purls meet. Then stitch back up through the last bead in the group of 5. Pick up 4 11-ohs and stitch down in the spot where the next 2 purls meet. If you're looking straight on, pushing your needle straight down between the 2 beads. Then stitch back through the last 11A added. Repeat this process all the way around. If you can't do it in one go, you can always stitch back through the non-woven and then go back through the 4th bead added. When you get to the last purl, pick up 3 11As and stitch down into the first 11A added in the first group of 5, then through the non-woven stitching base. Make a couple stitches between the front and the back to secure your thread and then trim it for now. To attach the seashells on either side of the beadwork, apply some jewelry glue. This is Aleene's Jewel It. You can also use Jewel Bond or any kind of super glue that works with metal, glass, and fabric. Then place the shells seashells down on the spaces designated for them on either side of the beadwork that you've done, lining them right up against the last row of beads you stitched with 11As. If you need to, you can do this step ahead of time to prepare for class by simply gluing down these shells where indicated on the patterned base. Once the shells are glued in place and the glue is dry, which is usually at least 24 hours, or immediately if you're using super glue, cut out the centerpiece shape from the non-woven stitching base by cutting around the outside black line. This is best to do with a pair of short, sharp scissors. Don't be too worried about any little bits of white that might be remaining, because you're going to be adding edge beads, and that will sort of mask those little areas. Start a new working thread anywhere within the non-woven stitching base. Then bring it out of the non-woven stitching base close to the edge. If you bring it out close to one of these lines, you'll be closer to adding the beads in on the spots where the lines exactly are later on. You'll see what I mean later on by that. Pick up 111A and 111B. Stitch through the non-woven stitching base close to the edge, about 1 bead's width away. You can either go front to back or back to front. I just usually like working back to front. Then stitch through that last bead added again. Pick up 111A and stitch through from back to front about 1 bead's width away. Then back through the 11A just added. Next, add an 11E with the same brick stitch edge technique so that the colors are alternating A, E, A, E. And repeat this all the way around the edge, around the entire edge until you get back to the beginning. After adding the last bead and brick stitch edging and stitching through it, stitch down into the first bead added. You may find that you end up with 2 11As next to each other, but that's okay. Stitch from back to front or front to back below that first bead, and then back through that first bead again, and that should correct its position. Now with your thread coming out of that first 11A, pick up 1 11A, 2 15-0s, and 1 11A. Stitch into the next 11A on the edge. Using the lines drawn on the non-woven stitching base as a guide for how long your line of beads should be, pick up a couple 11As and 2 to 3 15-0s. Try to make your line of beads about the length of the nearest line drawn on the template. Then using these lines also as a guide for the direction to stitch, stitch in a spot down toward the shell bead. The idea is to have these beads lie flat against the non-woven stitching base. Stitch up about an 11/0 beads width away near where the lines are completed, and add a similar group of beads that can reach out to the next 11A on the edge. So in this case I'm going to add my 2 15/0s and 2 11As. Oops. Stitch out through the next 11A on the edge. Pick up 1 11A, 2 15/0s, and 1 11A. Stitch into the next 11A on the edge. Try not to catch the non-woven stitching base when you do. Continue to add these lines of beads, always ending with 2 or 3 15/0s closer to the shell than the edge, and using the lines drawn on the non-woven stitching base as a guide. In the areas where the lines get longer and closer to the shell, make sure your lines of beads do the same thing. Once you've added these lines of 11As and 15/0s all the way around, and you wind up coming out of an edge bead or you've just stitched down through the non-woven stitching base, you want to work your way to a spot where you're coming out of the non-woven stitching base between groups of 11As and 15/0s and heading toward an 11E that's on the edge. So to do that, here I'm going to stitch into this 11E on the edge next to the one my thread was coming out of, and then stitch down into the non-woven stitching base, then stitch back up through the non-woven stitching base, and this is where I'm going to start my long lines of colored beads. For this step you're going to be using your 11Bs, 11Cs, 11Ds, and 11Es, 4 different colors of 11/0s. And the goal is to mix these colors. So in each line of beads you pick up, the beads that are closest to the pearls will be 11Es, next bead further out will be 11D, then 11C, and then 11B right up next to the edge. So you want to pick up just 1, 2, or sometimes 3 of each of the colors of beads, so you get this sort of blending effect as you pick up the different lines of beads. You want to pick up enough beads in each line that your line of beads reaches out to the edge bead, but also your line of beads, you want it to puff out a little bit away from the surface. You don't want it to sit flat on the surface of the non-woven stitching base. You want it to sort of make a little arc from one spot to the other. So I'm going to try picking up 5 beads. I think I'm going to need 2 11Bs, 1 11D, 1 11C, and 1 11B. So I've got my 5 beads on there, and I'm stitching out through the 11E on the edge, and that's perfect. I like that. Looking at it from the side, you can see that that line of beads arches up, and that's the effect that we're going for. Now that I'm on the edge, I'm going to pick up 3 11Es, and I'm going to stitch into the next 11E on the edge, but I'm going to make sure I'm sort of going underneath the 11As and 15Os that are in a loop there. Stitch into the next 11E on the edge, making sure that you're going underneath the 11As and 15Os that form a little loop over that bead. Now pick up the same colors of beads you did in the previous line of beads, again trying to fit the line to that space but having it stick up a little bit. And you're going to be adding them in reverse order this time because you want the 11Es closest to the edge beads and the 11Bs closest to the shell. So I'm going to try one more bead, and last time I'm going to try 1 11E, 1 11D, 2 11Cs, and 2 11Bs. So I've got 6 beads on there. See how that looks. I'm stitching into the non-woven right near the shell. That looks good. Then I'm going to stitch over about a half bead's width away so I can add the next line of beads. I'm going to add that same combination of beads, but now I have to pick them up in reverse order. And I'm going to stitch out through the next 11E on the edge. I'll pick up 3 11Es, stitch into the next edge bead, or into the next 11E on the edge, I should say. So I'll just continue adding lines of beads this way. When you get to the areas like this, you're going to need to address some of these areas where there's not the 11 A's and 15 O's there yet. So what happens when I get to these spots is I'll usually like just stitch into the non-woven stitching base, and when you get to these areas here where there's clearly going to be large spaces between the beads, you're going to need to just address those and fill in some 11 A's and 15 O's there. So I'll add this line of beads right here, which looks like I can fit 3 beads. Maybe 4. And now that I'm in the non-woven, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add just a line of the 11 A's and 15 O's next to this line of beads in this gap that I have to fill in over here. So I'm just going to pick up 3 11 O's and add that line of beads next to the one I just added. And then I'm going to fill in a couple of 11 B's here. And just kind of try to continue these lines to fill in this whole gap. And I like to use just my 11 B's in this area down here so that it's a little bit darker. Your eye doesn't necessarily get stuck there because there's not a lot of contrast. I think I'm just going to put one single 11B here. Alright, so now this space is all filled in. I won't address this area till like I work my way all the way around and come back here. And now what I'm going to do is just make a couple stitches in the non-woven stitching base, working my way back to where I was over here, where I had stitched down into the non-woven stitching base, and I need to then stitch up in this space here to fill in with that next line of beads. And I'll just resume working around the centerpiece here. I'll do the same thing when I get to this gap over here. I'll address it the same way I did this one, by just working just beyond it, and then once I get to this space here, then I'll go back, fill it in, and then resume. Find the template for the bracelet base in your direction set and figure out what size you want your bracelet to be. The different lengths are listed in inches with lines that you should cut your paper template on if you want a bracelet of that length. My wrist is about 6.5 inches, so I'm going to cut on the 6.5 inch line. Now this measurement does include the extra length added when adding the clasp, so you should just make sure that you're choosing the length that corresponds to your actual wrist size. So I'm going to just cut on the 6.5 inch line on both sides of my template first. Now there are different lines for the rest of the shape of the bracelet base, because if you have a longer wrist, it allows you to have more surface area and a slightly thicker bracelet so that the whole thing is proportional if you cut to one of the longer wrist sizes. And if you're cutting to one of the shorter sizes, you do want to make sure you have a small tapered end on each side of the bracelet, so you'll want to choose one of the smaller shapes drawn here to cut on. So I'm going to choose this second shape here and just cut around, trying to stay roughly on that second line. so now that I have my template cut for my wrist, I'm going to put this paper template down onto my piece of blank non-woven stitching base and trace around the outside edge. And I also want to just mark the midline too for when I go to put on the centerpiece. So I'm just going to mark that line there. And I'm going to cut out the shape that I've just traced on the line that I've drawn. Alright, so now I've got my bracelet base cut out. Now I need to attach my silk du peony to my bracelet base, and I'm going to choose the side that I feel like looks more finished. Sometimes you'll get these little threads that kind of stick up from the surface. Sometimes they'll be loops, and sometimes they'll just be like knots. I'm going to choose the side that doesn't have any of those loops. They're more like knots on this side. And I'm going to make sure that's on the front side of my bracelet. So I'm going to choose the side without the marker to be the front side of my bracelet, because I want to have that that line in the back that I marked for my midline to be visible after I stitch this piece of silk to the non-woven stitching base. And I'm actually going to trim the silk a little bit. I'm going to draw like a couple lines here and make sure to cut to the inside of this. I just want to have my silk overlapping my base by about 1/2 inch on all sides. If I have any more of that hanging over, it's going to be overlapping just too much. So I'm going to try to cut this neatly. These scissors are not the sharpest anymore, but you can use a nice sharp pair of fabric scissors to cut out your silk. If you have a pair of the fabric scissors that are like pinking shears, where they cut a zigzag edge to help prevent fraying, that's a great thing to use. I do not own a pair of those, but that would be a great thing to use for this, because you do have to worry about the fraying a little bit that's going to happen when you cut this. Alright, so which side is my front? I think this is my back. So I'm going to place this, I'm going to start wrapping my silk around the back of the non-woven stitching base like this. And I've got a new thread with a knot on the end. And I'm going to just kind of skim the surface of the non-woven stitching base with my needle. I've stitched through the silk and then a little piece of the non-woven, and then I've come out the surface, and I don't have any stitches on the front of the silk. I'm just sort of skimming the surface to start my thread. And I'm gonna try to do this. Oops, my thread came out. It wasn't anchored well enough in my non-woven. I'm gonna stitch back through the surface, sort of skimming the surface with the stitch. I'm going to do this a couple more times just in this little spot here to try to just get that silk held in place in that one spot. Alright, and I'm straightening the silk out so there's no wrinkles on the front as I'm working. I'm going to wrap the other part here over and kind of hold it in place while I skim the surface over to there. So again, check the front. You don't want to have any stitches on the front through the silk because it will pucker if you have any stitches on the front. You want a nice smooth surface. And make a little stitch. Skimming the surface again. Stitch that part of the silk in place. Now you're going to work your way around, holding your silk down firmly, wrapping it over the edge of the non-woven as you work your way down, making these slightly large stitches through the silk and then through the non-woven without going through the silk on the other side. When you get to these rounded parts of the non-woven stitching base, you're going to have to make little folds in the silk and make sure you stitch through those folds to hold them in place when you do your skimming stitches. I'm just going to go check on the front and make sure I haven't stitched through the front of the silk. I haven't. When you get to the end of the bracelet, leave this overlapped silk intact. You want to have the silk go beyond the edge of the non-woven, and don't trim it away. Just leave that in place because you're going to be using that when you add the clasp. And I'm just trying to flatten this on the front before I make my stitches on the back. And I'm working my way back towards the midline. Ooh, I see on this end I'm short on my silk. I'm gonna have to trim away a little bit of the end of this non-woven, sacrifice a little length. So you're gonna wanna, that's something you wanna be aware of as you're stitching, that you're gonna have some leftover silk on the end on both sides. If you don't, attaching the clasp will be a little more difficult. So now I'm just going to work my way over to that side. I'm actually going to taper this a little bit more. you have excess fabric on the ends of the bracelet like this, you can kind of just trim away some of the excess that's overlapping. You want the back to be flat when you add the ultra suede later on. Now you're going to take the centerpiece and stitch it down to the center of the bracelet base. You can use the line drawn on the back, the midline, as a guide for where to place it. It should be in about the center between these two ends that stick out. And just checking where it is on the front. And then you can use either the thread hanging from when you stitched your silk on the base, or you can use your thread hanging on the centerpiece itself to stitch the centerpiece down. I'm just going to hold the centerpiece in place with my thumb and my fingers, and then make stitches straight through all the layers between the centerpiece and the bracelet base. I'm hiding my stitches by stitching between my rows of beads on the front, using a color that kind of matches my overall bead color on the front. The stitches I'm making on the front are smaller than the stitches I'm making on the back. When I happen to go through a bead like I just did here, I back out of that bead because I don't want to pull any of my beads toward the back of the centerpiece or toward the non-woven base. I want to make sure I'm stitching between beads only. And I'm just kind of staying close to the edge of the centerpiece as I stitch, so if the edges aren't going to stick up later on. You can even just do this from the front, not looking at the back, because the back is going to get covered with ultra suede, so it really doesn't matter what it looks like in terms of what the stitches look like. I am looking at the back when I get into these areas where I know the bracelet base stops, so that I'm making sure I am actually stitching the centerpiece to the bracelet base. Once that part is secure, you can weave in, secure, and trim your thread. I'm going to do that by just making some of those skimming stitches on the back. Now's the time to decide what configuration you want for your starfish and your sand dollars on the open sides of your bracelet band. So as you can see on this example, they're kind of placed in a random spot on each side and then beaded around sort of randomly. So this is where you get to choose. I don't say exactly where to put these, but just take a moment and kind of decide where you want to place them. I think I'm going to add mine like that. So put jewelry glue on the back side of the stones. I'm using Crafter's Pick Jewel Bond and sort of dabbing it onto my little starfish. And I'm going to place it down where I want it. Oops. If you get any jewelry glue on your silk, wipe it off immediately. Be very careful about that, because silk really absorbs glue and it makes it change color, makes it stay darker. Now my sand dollar. So I like a sort of random configuration. That's why I'm not being too precise about this. I am leaving about a bead's width of space between the sand dollar and the starfish so that I can add beads between them like I have here, although you don't have to do that. Now allow the glue to dry for the recommended time according to the directions on the bottle. Once the glue on your starfish and your sand dollar is dry, you're going to add some embellishment beads around them. I do have a particular way I like to do this. Once the glue on the starfish and the sand dollar is dry, we're going to begin embellishing, just doing some bead embroidery around those two items. I like to do sort of random bead embroidery, but you can see that I do add my 11 A's around each of those glass pieces, and I add some pearls, add 11 A's around those, and then I do little lines of beads that consist of alternating 11 O's in the different colors, the same colors and patterning used in the centerpiece, and lines of 15 O's. You can use any of the working threads that you have hanging for this process. You just want to weave over to the area you want to work on. I'm going to be doing that skimming stitch where I'm just skimming the surface on the back of the bead embroidery to move my needle over. And then I'll start around the starfish. I'm using 2 bead back stitch to do this, or it could be up to 3 beads, it just depends on where they're going. And I'm just trying to stitch them around the outside edge. When I get to the corner, sometimes I'll just add 1 bead because my line is going to be changing directions, and it'll be neater that way. After surrounding this starfish and completing this last bit of back stitch, I'm going to stitch to the back and then do that skimming stitch again to work my way over to the sea urchin. Or sorry, the sand dollar. And I'm going to then back stitch 11A's around this one as well. I don't always do this, but I am a little concerned about my sand dollar coming off. Normally it's just glued down and that's that, but for whatever reason my glue isn't sticking as well as I'd like, so I'm going to just bring my thread up through one of the holes in the sand dollar, add a 15-0, and stitch back down just to anchor that bead there, and I'll do it on the other holes as well. This is just an option you have to help the sand dollar stay in place so that it does not fall off the bracelet later. It can be tricky to find the holes sometimes, to stab around a little bit. Now I have to determine where my pearls are going. You should have 6 extra pearls after doing the centerpiece that you can distribute between the 2 sides of the bracelet. I like to put 3 on each side, but you can put more on one side than the other if you like, or you can not use them at all if you don't want them. I'm going to put one nestled right up against my starfish and my sea urchin here. And just make sure you stitch through those more than once when you add them. And once I add one, then I like to backstitch 11A's around it before adding another. I think I'm going to add another one right over here next to the backstitched row of 11A's. Alright. I think I'm going to add a third one over here maybe. Or maybe over there. But since I'm working in this area right here now, I'm going to add some of those lines of beads. Right up close to the centerpiece, I'm going to just add some 11 beads there for color. Sort of wrapping around a line of 11 A's. It's totally up to you how far you go with these lines of beads. Just going to add one more here. And then I'm going to leave this space here for adding those lines of beads of different colors. Alright, so now I'm going to work back over here. Starting up close to the backstitched 11 A's, I'm going to add a line of beads that starts with the 11 B's, then 11 C's, 11 D's, and 11 E's. Just making like a little line there. And then next to it I'm going to add a little line of 15 O's. Just add like 3 of those. Just trying to sort of imitate the look of these colored lines of beads with the 11A and 15O color in between. And I'm going to try to angle them around, so as I work around the pearl, they're sort of angled out from the center of the pearl in sort of a circular fashion. I'm going to leave that area like that and then start a different set down here. This part is really pretty abstract. You can kind of just add color and lines where you want. Alright, so I'm going to leave that as is and go over this side over here. I think I'm going to add my my little lines starting in this little crevice. See how many I want on there. That's a good size. Sort of comparing it to the space. And I think I'm just going to add some 11Bs around this part of the sand dollar. And back stitching some on here. And then I'm going to add the pearl right here, the third pearl. And I'm going to add my 11As and back stitch around that. Alright, that brings me to the very end of my bracelet. I have absolutely no more room to add any more beads. So I'm actually going to go back over here and I want to add a little bit more of that blue color here. So I'm going to do that skim stitch on the back. And that's it. Happy about that. And now I'm going to work my way to the other side and repeat that process. And I'm not going to copy this side necessarily. I'm just going to add everything organically and figure it out as I go. And in general, I'm just taking kind of a less is more approach. I like my fabric showing on all sides of this beading. Once you've finished the beading on both sides of your bracelet, you're going to add the ultra suede backing. Use a jewelry or a fabric glue like Aleene's Fabric Fusion and just spread a nice layer on the back side. I have a zillion pencils in my house, so is one of the things I use sometimes to apply the glue. With a water-based glue like this, you want to apply a nice, even, thick layer to both the part of the project, the bracelet base, as well as the little parts of the non-woven of the centerpiece that are exposed. With a water-based glue like this, a lot of it is going to absorb into the fabric and dry, and you need to have a lot in order to get good adhesion between the surface of the back of the bracelet and the ultra suede backing. Make sure you apply the bracelet with the glue on it to the correct side of the ultra suede. The side that I actually want to see is the side that has more fuzz on it. This side here. The side that looks more like it's just like a puckered sponge is the back side of the ultra suede. So that's the side you want to stick your bracelet down on with the glue on it. Once you've stuck these together, wrap them around a cylindrical object. I'm just using another glue bottle here, and hold them in place using an elastic or something else to tie around. Then allow the assembly to dry for at least 24 hours. Once your glue is dry on your ultra suede and bracelet assembly, I'm going to remove it from the cylindrical object and trim the ultra suede around the outside edge. Be very careful not to cut the silk when you do this. In these areas here, make sure you cut in around the same shape as that rounded portion of the bead embroidery. You can always trim the ultra suede away more later, so just be very careful and err on the side of not trimming away enough, because you can always trim it more later. And you can't put it back if you cut it away. In these areas here, I'm trying to trim to just behind the edge beads that are there. I'm just going to go around and trim the areas where there's a little bit of excess ultra suede. These corners can be very tricky to get the ultra suede just right. I'm just going to keep trimming until I like the edge all the way around. Okay. You have a couple different options for finishing the edge of your bracelet. You can either leave it as is without adding any beaded edging, or you can do a stitched edge where you're just kind of sewing the ultra suede and the silk and non-woven together, or you could do two different types of beaded edging. First, I'll show you the just plainly stitched edge. I've got a new piece of thread here. It's in a neutral color that's just going to kind of disappear. And I'm going to kind of try to do that skim stitch where I'm going to stitch between the layers of ultra suede and edging in a place where my knot can kind of go away down near the clasp here. Alright, so I'll trim away that little piece of tail later. But now what I can do is just sort of a whip stitch where I'm stitching a little bit further away from where my thread is coming out. About a few beads width away through the ultra suede toward the silk at an angle, angled in the direction I'm working. And I'm trying to just kind of catch a little tiny bit of the silk on the edge. That little whip stitch can just pull the two edges together. You can make smaller stitches even if you like. It just makes it a little more secure. You can do this and add a bead. I like to use the 11 E's on the edge of the project because they're matte and they don't stand out so much. So here's an 11E. I'm going to do that same stitch now, but I'm going to have the bead on here. So that bead just adds a little bit of decoration from the front, and I would just repeat that all along the edge. The other edging technique you can do is brick stitch edging. To start that, you would, wherever you start your thread, pick up two 11 E's, stitch about a bead's width away from where your thread is coming out from front to back, or back to front, very close to the edge. Then stitch through the last bead added, out away from the edge. Then pick up one bead, stitch about a half bead's width away, very close to the edge, and then stitch back through that last bead added. So then I would just repeat this all the way around if I'm doing the brick stitch edging. That creates a different look because it's a continuous beaded edge. So you can choose from those 4 different options. Regardless of what edging technique you're using, when you get to the areas where you have the center piece overlapping your bracelet band and you have ultra suede behind it, you really here just want to stitch the ultra suede to the non-woven stitching base. So you can do that by just stitching between the 2 layers. Just try to keep your stitches basically hidden between the front and the back. I'm kind of stitching between beads on the front. And then once you get past this area, you can resume whatever edging technique you were using before that. So I chose whip stitch, and that's what I'm going to go back to now. When you get to the end of the bracelet, don't do your edging stitch there. This is where you're going to add the clasp. If your ultra suede is adhered to the silk hanging off the end of the bracelet, just pull it away, and you're going to take your clasp, wrap the silk around the end of your clasp, and you want to basically just stitch this little bit of silk that's going through the loop on the clasp to the underside of the bracelet. So use whatever thread you're using for the edge beads, and you're just going to stitch back and forth just make little stitches between the front of your silk and the silk where it overlaps on the back. The stitches on the front should be very little so that you don't see the thread as much. The stitches on the back can be bigger. Alright, and then once that's really secure, you're going to overlap your ultra suede again with your silk. Pull any of these little threads that are shredding off the end of the silk, or trim them away as you're working. So this ultra suede is then going to overlap with the silk on the end, and we're going to trim away the excess. So working from the front, just trim away the excess ultra suede. And then you're going to stitch the edge of the ultra suede to the edge of the silk. And I like to do that by doing sort of whip stitches around the edge of the two layers. You have to kind of go through the clasp. Yeah, I'm going to see if I can just get my ultra suede through here. Come on. Just to try to make it a little easier to stitch between these two layers. Alright, so those two layers are stitched together there. I'm going to stitch these parts together here that same sort of whip stitch technique where my thread is wrapping around the edge. It's a little crooked, it's a little on the diagonal, but I think it'll be okay when I'm wearing it. And now I'm going to resume my whip stitch edging with beads till I get to the opposite end of the bracelet. If you get to the end of the bracelet and you don't have enough excess silk to wrap around the toggle bar loop like I do on this piece, what you can do is first stitch the two layers together using whip stitch edging. If your silk is fraying a little bit, just make really close together stitches to kind of bring that fray down and hold it in place. You can also spray it with something like fray check or dab a little bit of jewelry glue or fabric glue on here, either before or after this process, to keep those threads in place later. I'm just trying to make very small stitches so that the beading thread helps hold down the silk threads. And then I'm just going to trim away some of the excess here. I'll probably dab some glue on there after as well to make sure it doesn't fray any further, because that is an issue with this particular fabric. Alright, so now that that is stitched, I'm going to actually stitch the toggle bar loop to the end of the bracelet using beads. So I'm separating from the other end. I'm going to make sure I'm oriented correctly. Stay oriented like that. So in this case, I'm going to use my 15-0s because they're a matching color. They're going to kind of blend in with the toggle bar. So I'm going to pick up 5 of these guys, go through the loop of the toggle bar, and then stitch through both of the layers. So I've got a loop of beads now holding that toggle bar in place. Then I'm going to stitch between both the layers a little further away from where the first loop of beads is. You got to pick up that same number of beads, so it was 5 15-0s I used. Pass my needle through the loop of the toggle bar and then stitch from back to front. A little bit away from. Oops. Make sure I'm not getting tangled. I am tangled here. Your toggle bar gets turned around like this. You want to make sure you reorient it before continuing on. And now I'm a little too close to that loop to make another one here, so I'm just going to stitch a little bit further away and make a third loop of beads through the toggle bar loop. And then I'll go through and reinforce those 3 loops of beads again.